We will now ask our panelists to please step forward and take your seats on the stage. This is our panel on transforming economies through partnerships. Gentlemen, please join us. Thank you.
I am Africa.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, one of the interesting things that I think President Kagame asked in the previous session was the question of how to accelerate development change. And one answer to that is, of course, the concept of partnerships that leverage the capabilities of the partners to achieve more and to achieve that more quickly than each could do on its own. So in that spirit, we have an outstanding panel joining us this evening. I'm going to go through each of the panel members in turn, from my immediate left, Carlos Lopez, to the end of the line, and I'm going to ask them for 2 or 3 minutes, very brief ideas, insights from their experience about how to achieve transformation through partnership activities. So let me start with Carlos. Carlos Lopez is, of course, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and a very experienced person, I think, in the arena of public-private partnerships and also understanding the African investment scene. So, Carlos, give us a few ideas from your experience, please.
Thank you. Let me greet the Latin American presidents and clarify to them that my name has nothing to do with Latin America. I'm from Guinea-Bissau, and our links with Latin America are drugs.
Oh, dear.
We have just concluded the elections after our coup number 7. And what is interesting is that if you just look at the news this week, part of the news is about Thailand and the coup in Thailand. They are in coup number 10. And despite being coup number 10, they export more manufactured goods than all of Africa. And I think the reason why we should be mindful of this type of comparators is because Africa gets cheated in terms of its branding. And it is very important for us to be attentive about the landscape. It's not just Thailand. This week you had news about the unrest in Vietnam. Very important for us because it means the Chinese may be looking into opportunities of bringing their manufacturing into Africa because they are in a very difficult neighborhood. Also the news about Ukraine. It's all about energy. And the energy dimensions of the crisis tell us that the US may be able to give Europe what they will not get from the Russia. But Russia is giving what they are not probably going to deliver in Europe into China. All of this has implications for Africa. We are looking into a situation where extractive industries that only create about 1% of jobs in the continent are not really the way into the future, unless we transform them. Without value addition, we are not going to be able to take advantage of our bounty. And our bounty is basically the old model. It is the colonial model, where you extract, you get into a port, and you export raw. And this has been our tragedy. It doesn't create jobs. It doesn't bring transformation. So even when we are talking about growth, it's growth without quality. How can we change this? By changing the nature of our partnerships. In fact, the word partnership is a bit abused. By changing the nature of our relationships, full stop. It's about trade and making a level playing field. It's about making sure that the negotiating capacity of Africa is increased. Its assertiveness is going to respond to the issue of integration that has been mentioned here so many times. And it's not happening yet, but we have to take advantage when the winds are in our sails. The winds are in our favor, and we have to take advantage of these winds. Let's take the example just of trade. If we take into account the way Africa is trading, we have the same size as India. Now, what is the impression that people have? Is that India is an emerging power and that Africa is trailing behind. Actually, this does not correspond to the truth. If you take into account India as one country with 1.1 billion people, more or less the demographic size of Africa, and you try to compare the entire continent with India, not just country by country, you will be amazed to see that India is more poor than Africa. Their average GDP per capita is lower than Africa, that Africa has more cell phones, more internet penetration than India. Africa is attracting more foreign direct investment than India. The #1 investor in India is Mauritius, because it is used as a filter for investment in that country, which is an African country. And you can go on with the comparators. And this is not the perception we have. So how do we address the issue of branding is essential for us to be able to get the investors, the private sector, both at the local level, not just international, as well as multinational corporations, to understand their perception of risk in Africa is wrong. And it is for Africans to transform this reality.
Okay, good. Very good. I just want to ask you, Carlos, a very quick follow-up. Beyond economic integration, or the lack thereof, what do you see as the biggest obstacle to private sector engagement in Africa?
Well, McKinsey did a study, and they interviewed about 1,500 corporate actors, and they tried to understand what was exactly their preoccupation, their fear about investing in Africa. And they came up with a list that starts first with economic predictability, good macroeconomic policies, but at the same time predictability that they are not going to change up and down. Well, the news are rather good. Any macroeconomic indicator in Africa is going in the right direction. So this is a very important element. Second, they say political instability and conflict. And it's a very peculiar aspect, because if you look again into the numbers of people affected by conflict in Africa, you are talking about 100 million people, roughly, in a continent of 1.1. And someone was saying before, I think it was President Quiroga, that you don't say you are going to have Ebola in Guinea. You are going to say you have Ebola in Africa. Each time there is a negative element, it's about the entire continent, and it's the same for conflict. Okay. And then the third element that they mention is the fact that they would like infrastructure to be put way up in terms of priority, particularly energy. And I think it's absolutely on the spot, this one. But if you look into the investments that are being made in Africa on infrastructure, we have about 1/4 of what we need being invested per year. But what is interesting is to compare to what was happening 10 years ago, which was almost nothing. So I think if you take just these three, the corporate world needs to be educated about what is really happening.
All right, thanks, Carlos. Now, Jean-Philippe is the Vice President for Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean, as a matter of fact, for the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. So I'm sure you have some views that complement those of Carlos, but maybe also some additional insights for us.
Thank you. Let me first start by thanking President Bongo for hosting here, and of course say thank you also for President Kagame to come here. He knows that he is one of my models. He's a great model of leadership, so thank you for your leadership, President Kagame. And let me also, of course, work on Latin America, welcome the Latin American president. It's a continent that I love, being from Haiti myself, being from the Caribbean. To try to add to what Carlos was saying, I think when he mentioned infrastructure, it's really key because we're all talking about better macro investment framework, better investment climate. This is all true. Those are the basics. But frankly, there has been a lot of progress that have been made already on the continent. There's still a lot more to be made, but there's a lot of progress. I'll just give you some data from what we are doing ourselves every day in the IFC. When I first started really working on Africa in 2003, we were doing $140 million per year of investment as an institution. Today, we do more than $5 billion. Actually, last year we did $5.3 billion in Sub-Saharan Africa. And Sub-Saharan Africa is the second largest after Latin America region within the IFC. Latin America, we still do more than $6 billion. So to give you an idea of the progress, just in 10 years, just one institution. Having said that, if there are some basics that you don't have, like I want to talk about infrastructure, it's not going to work, or you're not going to be able to compete. We're talking about electricity, energy, power in general. If you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, today they install capacity in more or less 80 gigawatt. So which is what? Equivalent to what you have in Spain, just for the entire continent. And it's about, on GDP per capita, it's, the level of install capacity is, the level is 10 times more in Latin America, for example. And so really, on that front, you name it, it's important. But you talk about other infrastructure, you said road transport. If you want to bring your goods to market, it is estimated that about 60% of, depending on the places, 40–60% of food is wasted because you can transport them to market. And you can continue, and so on and so forth. And ourselves, we have been investing a lot in that. So I would think infrastructure is key. But I would want only talk about physical infrastructure, but I would talk also about social infrastructure. People talk about education and health. I mean, we have had other examples, whether from the presidents who were there, we were talking, and you mentioned it, education is important, but also if you don't feed the kids, I mean, they can't go to school, they can't learn, can't do anything. So all of those things, I think, are very important for leaders to focus on. And so I'll leave this for others.
Let me ask one follow-up. Among all of the IFC projects in Africa that you have been a party to, can you give us one or two brief examples of ones that have been very successful, and why have they been successful?
One successful and?
Yeah, just one success story, and why?
Oh, okay, and why? I would say, which one I would take? I mean, there are many I could choose, but I'll try to go in the energy, in power sector. I would say if you take, I'll take a very recent one actually. If you take in Côte d'Ivoire, a country just coming out of conflict, with the leadership and the commitment that they have shown to what they could do over the past, I would say, 12 months, let's say 12, 18 months, we have actually invested, and I'm not taking one project, I'm taking one program. We have invested $800 million, roughly, in the power sector, in electricity, to convert in a number of projects that are converting, some of them actually, I don't want to get into many technical terms, but we have been able to double basically the capacity by just changing some simple cycle to combined cycle, putting gas. Now, if you take Uganda, and I will take one running one, if you take Bujagali, it's 250 megawatt hydropower, okay. And today that makes a huge difference in Uganda. It costs about almost $1 billion, about $900 million, and that was a joint effort from the World Bank Group there. And that was really very powerful, actually, in Côte d'Ivoire was the World Bank Group. But in Bujagali, as IFC, we came up with equity, we came up with loan, but we also mobilized funds from others, and our colleagues, we work with the World Bank. The bank came with partial risk guarantee, and also MIGA, which is insurance guarantee from the World Bank Group. MIGA came to provide guarantee, also a political risk guarantee to the entrepreneurs. Actually, as a World Bank Group, we provided from our own resources about close to $400 million to that project.
Okay, super. I'm just going next. I think I will go next to Mostafa TERRAB, because OCPT has done some very important things under your leadership. And as chairman and CEO of OCPT, talk to us a little bit about South-to-South partnerships and also what you are doing in Gabon, in this region.
Thank you, John. Look, I think before talking about South-to-South and precisely what we're doing actually here with our Gabonese friends, South-to-South is a way to bridge something that I think is extremely important, has been alluded to previously in terms of transforming mentalities, but I would call it a perception gap. And I think the mentalities that have to be transformed are not so much African mentalities, but mentalities from the outside. The perception gap I have in mind is a perception gap from the north, and it's specifically about the economic potential of a continent like Africa. I think to accelerate the development, that perception gap has to be bridged. Let me take the sector I am in, which is agriculture and fertilizer. Africa is perceived to a large extent, we talked about security and the over-perception of negative of Africa, but if you talk about food security, by and large, we think of Africa as the locus of the problem. If you think that 80% of the arable land in Africa is still not used, and if you think that to do that, the African farmer has to have fertilizer available, that the natural resources to make fertilizers are plenty in Africa. In fact, most of them are exported out of Africa, transformed out of Africa, and then re-imported at very expensive prices, and too expensive for the African farmer, then this is where the problem. Africa, it is clear, with 80% of its land still available, will be the part of the solution of food security, but that would require investment. This is what we're doing and planning to do with our Gabonese friends under the leadership of Monsieur le Président de la République, which is put together for the first time natural resources out of Africa, here natural gas out of Gabon and phosphate out of Africa, for the first time to produce fertilizer for the African economy and not to export it out of Africa.
Right. And so the more of the value chain will be retained in Africa with the margins associated with it.
It is not only the margins, but that ensures that the fertilizer in Africa will be much cheaper, and then having the upstream integration to natural resources allows us to tailor-make, so to speak, the fertilizer to adapt it to the soil and the crops in Africa.
Okay, excellent. Now let me turn to Mr. Issad REBRAB. Mr. REBRAB is the CEO of Cevital, which is one of the most important family conglomerate businesses in Algeria. So Mr. REBRAB, can you talk to us about how you see Africa today as an opportunity?
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Permettez-moi d'abord de...
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me start by thanking, of course, our host, Mr. Ali Bongo, as well as President Kagame, and the different presidents who kindly came all the way from Latin America to listen to their peers and share their experience. And as far as I'm concerned, I would tell you that it's Africa's turn to move on to an accelerated growth. We can think without hesitation of a two-figure growth, I believe. And quite obviously, we need, for that matter, adequate infrastructure, states of law, and investors such as ourselves are, of course, more than willing to invest in various African countries. And later on, I will tell you a little bit more about my own group's development plan in Cevital. But the only thing is, ports, because there aren't only just roads, of course, ports, railways. And I think, again, harbors or ports are the economic vital lungs, central hubs of our countries, because the majority of our freight exchanges come and go through performing, successful ports. And in that respect, we have an experience to share that I will dwell upon a little bit in greater details in a moment. So now coming back to Cevital, which is a family group that I founded with $5,000 in 1971. I used to be a teacher, and I had an accounting consultancy as well, and I decided to take a very modest participation share in a metal SME that I then tried to develop by constantly re-injecting some of our results, and we managed to drag our profits up. And then my associate partners say, okay, we want to stop investing because we're afraid of being nationalized. And then, in the meantime, I had created my own company, Profilor. Same thing happened, in fact. Started off with 4 employees, and 4 years later, we'd reached 200. And same thing, we kept re-injecting our dividends or our profits into the group's expansion. And now, Cevital has undergone a two-figure growth of 34% over the past 14 years. We've moved from $50 million turnover in 1999 to more than $3.5 billion last year. And of course, we're fully intent on carrying on at the same speed. In what sort of sectors did we invest? Well, a variety of them. The food industry, where the Food African magazine actually ranked us #1. In Africa, we also own the biggest sugar refinery in the world, and also the first oil refinery of Europe and Africa included. Concerning sugar, we are responsible for moving from importers to exporter status in our country in more than 28 different countries where we're exporting. Same goes for flat glass. We've got the major production line in Africa, and in 3%, in fact, of this production covers 100% of the Algerian needs, and we're exporting 10% towards Maghreb and 65% of our products towards Europe. We're also present on the electronic front, household machines. We're also producing power. We've got 300 power plants. We're also present on the commercial supermarkets, mall fronts. We're also, it's a commercial distribution. And then also on the automobile industry and public roadworks, contractors, and also building trailers. So everything we did up to this day has rested its case on an internal type of growth. That's to say, geared towards Algeria with a number of new investments that we keep adding onto. We currently have 3 plants in construction in Algeria. One in the electronic household market, with another one basically for window frames, and then a cement industry with 12 million tons volume cemetery. And now we're basically planning, and since 2012, we've decided to diversify even further and expand our investments out of Europe, that is in Africa and Latin America. But we started off with Europe, in fact, and essentially France, of course. Last year, we took over an alien company. It's called UXO, which is, as a matter of fact, the well, the leader in France for window double glazing. We managed to redress it and put it right back on track in less than 6 months. And 2 months ago, we bought over the group Fragoff in France, which also was undergoing a number of difficulties, and where we now intend to not only maintain all the European employments, existing European vacancies, but also to increase them and diversify them on the research and development center front, but also to develop and set up a production unit in Algeria, where we shall create 7,000 new jobs in this very sector. So basically, in view of this sort of balance sheet, if I have one type of recommendation to formulate perhaps to our African presidents, I would say certainly you're not running out of economic operators. And you can buy everything nowadays, technology as well as know-how. But what you have to watch out for, or fully understand, is that you need to facilitate creation of employment and wealth. And once this wealth is created, you can then redistribute them by means of tax policies, basically. Today, Cevital, we're the first exporter of Algeria, but also, therefore, the first tax contributor to the Algerian state. And we shall continue our development, but we run into some bureaucratic problems that we wish we could avoid and hope most African countries will save us in the future. And we also have some interests vested in Rwanda. We took part in a joint venture there for the regulation of wheat in Rwanda by investing 40% in a regulatory body, basically, for Rwanda.
Two panelists remaining, and we have Robert Wolf from the US, who was the head of the Americas region for UBS and also a counselor to President Obama. And then we have Lionel ZINSOU, who is the president of Pay Partners in France. And I think perhaps I start with Lionel and then Robert to round out the panel. Lionel, your thoughts?
Oui, je voudrais m'associer.
Yes, I'd like to include myself in the thanks that we've expressed to President Ali Bongo, President Kagame, and the Latin American President Santu. Say how proud I am in my quality to be counted among the guests of this forum, because I know that it's a privilege to be re-invited in here. Then also, I agree fully with what Mr. Carlos Lopez and the Vice President of the SFI previously said. Africa certainly deserves to be known, better known. Its results are exceptional. It took a long time to open the world's eyes on what Africa really meant and really embodies. We had a concept about 10 years ago called Afro-optimism, and we used to talk about a sort of naive Afro-optimism. In fact, it was a regrettable association, in fact, where that was part of a rather spread out preconception. And in fact, we're going to have to keep fighting that sort of prejudice, basically. And the figures, of course, support our discourse. Now, the public authorities are beginning to look at Africa in a different way, obviously, and to look out for more egalitarian partnerships, more original and creative ones. But I'm not sure we've completely fully won all the public opinions to our cause. I think a form of commiseration for Africa, perhaps, which is not the product of the Africans' doings, of course, still pervades throughout Europe. And we have to free Africa from that sort of commiseration. A little bit like Africa looks at the emerging countries, perhaps. That's to say, with their full potential and the respect that is due to them. So, Mr. TERRAB and President REBRAB, I also appreciated your contributions because what you just said refers to the missing link of African development, basically. We used to have a primary an investment in the primary sector that was organized exclusively around the extracting industry or the farming industry and all of those exports. In the meantime, we've developed a tertiary economy, which is particularly strong, and we've now grown into a continent that is, on the whole, majoritarily based on the tertiary activities. And that includes prodigious progress in the field of telecommunications, of course, which did a great deal of good to all the companies and the nations, of course, but also to our pride, simply because in the field of communication technologies, Africa is actually setting the tone. It is from Africa that we are gradually importing a number of more creative and more economical practices, which are getting more and more popular. And I find it extraordinary to see that Safaricom from Kenya, for example, is selling its payment solutions to the UK. That is now emulated by insurance companies or banking companies 5 years after these things were already proven to work and experienced by African companies or countries. So these companies are living proof of how the Africans can act as pioneers, basically, and avant-garde in their respective fields. But what we still missed so much was the second missing link, basically, of the economic development, and that's what Mostafa referred to, basically, by talking about strengthening certain investments in the industrial sector. And in, for example, in our tropical part of Africa, we were looking at Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, also in parts of the southern continent, as participating in the global growth and excluding or leaving us completely, well, ostracized or excluded from it. And in a way, I believe your leadership, Mr. Kagame, is an inspiration for us all. When I hear Mostafa say that they've got an immense valorizing project in Africa, or in Gabon, rather, and it's true that Mr. Ali Bongo, of course, Your Excellency's initiatives can be quoted as the type of model as well. Well, all of this demonstrates that we had a vision that was a vision of our secondary industry that was probably underestimated. Why? Because it wasn't creating sufficient employment. In fact, only 1% of the mining industry was creating employment, for example, and we were in a bit of a deadlock. We are experiencing a number of shortfalls because those industries are too capital intensive and not creating as much employment as they should. Even agriculture, which is the most capital intensive one, therefore the less susceptible to create employment, was doing better. So we really have to put the emphasis again on the secondary sector and on the industries, basically, because the youth that come out of our universities now don't know exactly what to head for, and this has unbearable cultural consequences. We've got 15 million children to put to work every year coming out of schools, and The only answer we have for them is head for the industry. Because the two sectors that create most employment today are called telecommunication and financial services. And that's all very well, but we need Mostafa and Issad to succeed and to show and demonstrate to our children that they are also the future of this continent.
I just come back to Carlos for a moment, if I may, and Jean-Philippe also, if I may, because there is this tension between, on the one hand, the employment imperative for young people and the need that everybody recognizes to invest in the infrastructure as the base, the foundation on which to build further economic development. How can those two be reconciled?
Well, I think it has been explained how you can create employment and the role of industry. I'm very much a champion of industrialization in Africa, so I can only concur vigorously with the words that have been expressed. But I think one of the reasons we haven't had industrialization before has to do with the experiences of the 70s in Africa, where industrialization was done mostly with state intervention and basically trying to imitate import substitution model of Latin America without having the conditions for it to succeed. And then the first oil shock came. The first oil shock was in 1972. A second one came in 1979, and most of the industrial base collapsed. So it was not sustainable. It was not done on a basis that could really get Africa into a sort of industrial revolution. And then, you know, we went through this very long phase of structural adjustment, where it was more about fixing the macroeconomics without any regard to some of the social consequences of such policies. Now, what we have to tell as a story is that in the last decade, Africa has doubled its GDP. If you look into where this has happened, you don't have many examples in the world. Even China took a bit more than 10 years to double its GDP, which basically means you have something going for Africa. And we know part of it is the commodity prices boom, but more importantly is internal consumption. Now, this internal consumption is not being based on the ingredients that make transformation possible. Most of it is tertiary, but it's tertiary with employment that is very precarious. In fact, most of it is economic activity rather than jobs. You know, only about 4 out of 4 people that have some economic activity in Africa, only 1 is actually in a decent job, and a wage-earning job, which basically is not giving us the basis for the employment to respond to the social pressures of the demographic dividend. And if we are going to really address that upfront, as much as we can do in terms of industry and its industrialization responding because it creates jobs, we will need policy coherence that only a few countries are demonstrating. There is now a drive for industrialization. And in the words of Mr. REBRAB, what he was telling us basically, he wants, as an investor, to have that policy coherence. He called it the bed. It's basically about creating the conditions. And that's why examples like the ones that have been referred, President Kagame, President Bongo, are responding to this need for policy coherence. It's good to have a vision. It's more important to have the practical drive to make it happen.
I'll come to you in a minute, Jean-Philippe, because we have to get Bob Wolf in at this point. How do you react to what you've heard, Bob?
Well, let's see. Let me start by saying you either save the best for last, or I'm the guy keeping everyone from cocktails. And no one wants to be in that situation, so I'm going to try to be quick here. First of all, it's an honor to be here. I've been up 36 straight hours, so if I slip up, you should all clap first before I begin this speech. There you go. Listen, it's 32 Advisors focuses on the two things every country and continent wants. They want inbound investment, and they want to increase exports. It's very simple. How do you get there? Well, it starts with leadership. You have two visionaries sitting in the front. You have President Bongo, you have President Gawami, and today, you also have barriers being broken down. You think about what New York Forum Africa has done, Richard and Cecilia Adias, what they have built. It's amazing. If you break down barriers and you have leadership, then that's the first step of people wanting to come in. But it's only the first step. You need both feet inside. Everyone talked about infrastructure, but it starts before that. You need to have education. And I would say most African countries today is not spending enough of their rapid GDP on education. You need to have good health care. Another thing today, where not enough African countries are focused on spending enough of their new GDP and growth on health care. For the most part, for an inbound investor to want to bring their money to a country, you need to have rule of law. And once again, that goes back to leadership. I was named after Robert Kennedy. Human rights and social justice is something that becomes critically important, especially where you see geopolitical risks today all over the world. So you need great leaders who they believe in will run a democracy the right way. You need to reduce poverty. The best way to reduce poverty is education. Okay, we're seeing around the world that there's absolutely no question that education is bringing everyone faster forward or slower. Those who are not educating people before they get into preschool, at the home, teaching people how to read, write, and speak appropriately. It starts with good parenting. I spent the last 24 hours in Africa. I'm amazed, okay, at how perception is not reality. The things going on here with the new leaders, okay, it's amazing. Okay, when I go back to the States and we do business around the world, I'm going to tell people, invest in Africa, invest in Gabon, invest in Rwanda. It's a special place with new visions. But to do that, you actually need infrastructure, okay? And everyone has said it, so I'm not going to spend time on it. But infrastructure is not just bridges and roads. It's ports. It's telecommunications. It's fiber optics. It's satellite. It's next generation GPS for airlines. It's everything that you can think of to make business more productive and more efficient. And I think that that's very important what everyone said here today. But the other thing is, it's the fastest multiplier of GDP growth. For every dollar spent, it's a multiple, okay, of a GDP return. So you have to have infrastructure right. I would say to, the visionaries in this room, when I gave my high school graduation speech a long time ago, I remember ending it by saying, you need a leader who keeps their eyes to the stars but their feet to the ground, okay? You have to run before, okay, you start flying. And I think there's an incredible opportunity here, but make no mistake about it. You are competing versus the US, okay? You're competing versus Mexico, Puerto Rico. You're competing versus yourself. It's better if you work together. 1 and 1 could make 3 in Africa when the regions work together instead of 2. But everyone wants the same thing. They want inbound investment. They want public-private partnerships. They want return on capital. They want barriers being broken down, okay? And they want great visionaries. So I will just say, think about what was said today. And I think Africa, especially Gabon, Rwanda, have incredible days ahead of them.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time, but I'm going to give Jean-Philippe the last word here, a comment, a response to the way in which Robert sees the agenda for Africa that he laid out.
Well, thank you. Well, I think, I agree with a lot of those things that he said. Everybody, but I think also one of the important things is that all of this is great, but President Kagame mentioned it. the difference will be in implementation. And that's what we see every day. And that's what makes the difference, because often you have the ideas. I mean, there are some countries I've visited myself in Africa where I work, and you find, I can say, among the brightest people in the world. And you see how come you're having, the results that you have. And clearly when you go down, you see implementation. And on all of this, you need one last thing I would like to mention here. There is also a word we haven't used much, is governance. I mean, it's a broad word, but it's so important, governance in all of things for our countries, because this is extremely important, because some big companies, you are not going to attract them into your countries if they don't feel comfortable.
Fabulous. Let's give our panelists a round of applause, please. Excellent comments. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I'd now like to ask Richard to come back on stage for a couple of additional awards. Please hold your seats.
La soirée s'étant prolongée.
So as we're running a bit late, so we won't keep you behind longer. There should have been something, but we really have a time constraint here. So we were going to give out some prizes, the Africa Design Award, and we'll do that later on, probably Sunday, in the presence of His Excellency, the President of the Republic. And we're also going to announce a huge initiative with our friends from Coin Afrique and Fontaine 4, a Grand Prix, a big prize for the African entrepreneurs. And we'll do that on Sunday because we really have time constraints here that we're up against. So first of all, I would like to thank you for having stayed so late. And after this very inspiring, inspirational panel, we saw very big African entrepreneurs. I would like to call up here on stage in Gabon. The maturity of enterprise doesn't wait for a number of years. I've been told that there's a really young entrepreneur at school who's already started to produce fantastic bracelets. I don't know if he's still with us. If he's here, I'd like him to come up with me on stage immediately. And I think that you've developed already in school some bracelets, and that you would like to offer one to the President of the Republic of Gabon and also one to the President of the Republic of Rwanda. So tell us maybe rapidly what it's about. So it's a company which has been founded by an NGO. So it's an NGO called GA Gabon, which makes bracelets. They've trained us up. You've been trained by an NGO, and now you're producing this autonomously, and you've created your own company. So I would like to finish that. I wanted to finish on this symbolic note, and I'd like to let you offer that to the President. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock for the follow-on of the second edition of the New York Forum Africa at 9 a.m. on the dot here. And I wish you a very good evening.